Bat black night rolls in from the rocky coastlines and drapes a cloak of sinister shadow over the fields, woods, lanes, towns and villages scattered across the ancient kingdom of East Anglia. Castle ruins stand gaunt and imposing, their hollow windows and time-ravaged chambers defiant guardians of long-ago glories and lingering memories. Indistinct forms flit across the hallowed walls of tumble-down monastic buildings as ghostly chants echo from dark recesses and phantom footsteps ring out from broken-down stairways that twist skywards but lead nowhere. And as the night's grim embrace becomes all-encompassing, the souls of previous times awake and creep from their daytime retreats to walk once more the places they knew so well in life. In this video, we are going to explore the haunted hotspots of the counties of Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, once part of the Anglo-Saxon territory of East Anglia and collectively known as the witch counties on account of the tragic fact that during the witchcraft persecutions of the 16th and 17th centuries, more people were executed here than in any other part of the country. Bounded to the west by the swamps of the fens, buffered to the east and north by the sea, and hemmed in at the south by the thick woodlands of Saxon Essex, this was for centuries an aloof and mysterious region populated by hardy and resourceful, but also extremely superstitious peoples. Despite the impressiveness of the region's formidable natural defences, successive waves of invaders did manage to breach them, and Romans, Angles, Saxons, Vikings, Danes and Normans have passed through here, all of them leaving their mark upon the landscape. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, imposing forts were erected along the coast to protect against potential incursions by foreign invaders, whilst during the First and Second World Wars, airfields and military bases were established here, making the region a vital plank in the nation's war effort. The ghosts that wander the rutted highways and byways are testimony to the region's ever-changing demographics, and their stories tend to reflect the beliefs and cultures that successive waves of settlers brought with them. Demonic hounds, tormented royals, and nebulous nobles all inhabit a spectral realm where myth and legend bond, and acts of long-ago infamy are often reenacted by phantom protagonists, much to the surprise and terror of astonished witnesses. So, without further ado, let the hauntings commence. Heading out of London, our first destination is the hilltop site of Pitsea Mount, where we encounter a forlorn stone tower, all that now remains of the former St. Michael's Church. A church has occupied this site for centuries, and the tower is thought to date from the 16th century. Despite its proximity to the A13, not to mention a modern neighbouring housing estate that is right on its doorstep, the tower exudes a mysterious air that is not in the least bit diminished by the fact that its main function today is to support a phone mast which crowns it. The church itself was rebuilt in 1871, albeit the tower from a previous incarnation was kept. By the 1950s, however, the church was showing signs of structural decay, and by the 1970s, various plans to secure its future had come to nothing, and with the last wedding having taken place here in May 1975, the church was dismantled, albeit much of its structure was put into storage, so in theory, reconstruction is not impossible. I have to say that having parked up on the nearby housing estate and walked up a tree-lined pathway to reach the summit of Pitsea Mount, St. Michael's Tower was a genuine surprise. Yes, the mobile phone mast perched on its roof is somewhat incongruous, but the tower itself is both striking and atmospheric, whilst at the same time possessed of a slightly melancholic air. A limestone slab located in front of the tower is thought to be the altar from the medieval church, and an eclectic mix of tombstones, remnants of the old churchyard, mark the final resting places of former parishioners, although the fissures that snake their way across the ground can instill feelings of trepidation in even the most hardened skeptics, as you never know who or what might emerge from the cracked earth. Mention of the graves brings me to the main reason for our visit, a chance to view what is known locally as the Witch's Grave. Several colourful legends are attached to this grey marble ledger tombstone on account of its bizarre inscription, which reads, Anne Freeman, born 30th of March 1837, died 20th of March 1879. So far, so good. But then, whoever composed it pulled out all the stops and let loose a vitriolic diatribe that didn't exactly sing the praises of the woman it memorialised. Here lies a weak and sinful worm, the vilest of her race, saved through God's electing love, his free and sovereign grace. Now, as grave inscriptions go, I do have to say that this is perhaps not the most flattering of tributes. She shares her grave with Stephen Brown Freeman, his wife Anne, and their 2 daughters, albeit their inscriptions are positively mundane compared to the harshness of that which remembers poor Anne Freeman. It is this harshness that has led to her final resting place becoming known locally as the Witch's Grave, and there is a long-held tradition that she was hanged nearby for witchcraft, and her ghost has haunted the church grounds ever since. An unlikely scenario, since England may have been the purveyor of numerous injustices in the Victorian era, but hanging witches was most certainly not one of them. In fact, the last woman to be executed for witchcraft in England is thought to have been Alice Morland, who was hanged in Exeter in 1685, a good 194 years before the demise of Anne Freeman. I say thought to have been, incidentally, because there is evidence to suggest that Alice may have avoided the gallows, but that's a story for another video. Returning to the summit of Pitsea Mount and the so-called Witch's Grave, we are left with the burning question: who was Anne Freeman, and why was she subjected to such a vitriolic outburst following her passing? Well, it would seem that Anne was in fact a servant who spent much of her adult life working in London, where she fell in love with her employer's son, by whom she became pregnant. Sadly, she miscarried, and thereafter she and her paramour went their separate ways, Anne remaining a spinster for the rest of her life, the sinfulness of her dalliance hanging over her until her death just 10 days short of her 42nd birthday in 1879. It was her perceived immorality which lay behind the epitaph on her gravestone. Most accounts point out that the inscription is couched in biblical terms and references reminiscent of a more religious age, and it is in no way suggesting that she was a witch, although, if I was her, I think I'd rather have it carved onto my tombstone that I was a witch, as opposed to that I was a sinful worm, but perhaps that's just me. Either way, the inscription has long resulted in this ordinary-looking tombstone being known as the Witch's Grave, a tradition that continues up to the present day, despite the fact that the only broomstick Anne Freeman probably ever held was the one she used for her chores as a servant in London. Which brings me to the second haunting of Pitsea Mount. In 1988, a group of teenagers playing in the churchyard one dark winter's night were startled when 2 large black dogs with fiery red eyes suddenly appeared out of nowhere, trotted across the hilltop, and then vanished into thin air. The consensus is that they had encountered 2 incarnations of Black Shuck, the demon hound that is said to roam the highways and byways of this region. We'll be hearing more about this fearsome beast elsewhere on our journey, but at Pitsea Mount it is comforting to know that, as aloof and mysterious as this spot might be when darkness has fallen, at least you won't find yourself struggling to get a signal should you need to phone for help or summon urgent medical assistance. Moving on, we arrive at Hadleigh Castle, of which little now remains save a handful of mouldering walls and a shattered round tower. It commands stunning views over the Essex marshes to the Thames estuary, and the chance of an encounter with any of the restless wraiths that haunt it, whose appearances are, to quote one recent poster on Facebook, proper scary, only adds to the air of mystery that hangs over the place. Begun in 1230 by Hubert de Burgh, building work came to an abrupt halt when, following a violent quarrel, Henry III attempted to stab his former regent de Burgh in a fit of rage, and then spitefully confiscated his unfinished castle. To rub salt into the wounds, Henry even continued the construction, as did Edward III, who made considerable additions in the 14th century. It became customary for Hadleigh Castle to be granted to a tenant for life, on the understanding that it would revert to the Crown upon the death of the occupant. Traditionally, these residents were royal consorts, most notably 3 of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Parr, although there is no evidence that any of the 3 ever visited, let alone lived at the castle. Following Henry's death, Edward VI sold the property on condition it be demolished and the stone used for building work elsewhere. Over the centuries that followed, Hadleigh Castle began disappearing bit by bit until little more than the picturesque ruin we see today remained. In the 18th century, stories began circulating that ghosts had been seen flitting about the ragged vestiges in the dead of night. It must be said that many of these tales were invented by smugglers in order to keep the superstitious locals away as they went about their nefarious business. To this end, they would also burn coloured lights in the ruins to convince the nearby residents that evil spirits were at large on the windswept hilltop. Legend holds that the highwayman Dick Turpin and his gang used the ruins as a base for a time and hid their ill-gotten gains in various recesses around the castle remnants. One of Hadleigh's greatest claims to fame is that it was painted by the artist John Constable. When I say it was painted by Constable, I don't mean that he turned up with a tin of emulsion and a couple of paintbrushes, but rather that having sketched the ruins in 1814, he put paintbrush to canvas and created what has been described as one of his most monumental works. As well as an impressive history, Hadleigh Castle can also boast several ghosts, and people report strange encounters with ethereal forms amidst the ruins on a regular basis. The demon Hound, who we learnt of earlier, is said to haunt the ruins. People have heard groups of women chattering amongst the ruins in the dead of night, albeit they can never see any of the conversationalists. The phantom form of a woman has been sighted gliding across the grass and vanishing into one of the walls of the round tower. But the most famous of the spectres is that of the White Lady, upon whom tradition has bestowed a fearsome reputation. Should she discover you in her domain at night, she will, it is said, compel you to dance. Round and round you will swirl until you drop to the ground exhausted, whereupon the devil will appear and claim your soul for eternity, a prospect I, for one, do most certainly not relish, and so we will bid a fond farewell to Hadleigh Castle and move on to our next location, the Essex village of Canewdon. There was a time when Canewdon was an isolated community renowned for its associations with witchcraft. Indeed, it was said of the majestic 15th century tower of the village church, St. Nicholas's, reputedly added by Henry V to celebrate his victory of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, that as long as it stands, 6 witches will be found living in Canewdon, 3 in silk and 3 in cotton. It is also stated that whenever a stone falls from the tower, one of those witches will die to be replaced by another. As far as a history of witchcraft goes, there is an account of a Canewdon spinster, Rose Pye, being tried at the Chelmsford Assizes in July 1580, charged with bewitching a local infant to death. She pleaded not guilty and was in fact acquitted, although she wasn't immediately released, and she died in jail a few months after her acquittal. Canewdon's reputation as a hotbed of witchcraft continued to grow over the succeeding centuries, and by the 19th century it was widely reported that the village was being terrorised by witches who were inflicting locals with all manner of ailments, illnesses and indignities, such as releasing plagues of lice upon them, causing the wheels of their carts not to turn, and immobilising those who got on the wrong side of them. There was the story of old Peggy Sawyer, one of the cotton witches, who was mocked by a small boy one day when she went out gathering sticks. She gave him a baleful look, and he was instantly frozen to the spot, where he stood as if made of wood, until Peggy returned from her chore and unwished him. The most famous of the 19th and early 20th century witches was George Pinkengill, a farm labourer who was famed in the district as a cunning man and who was renowned for his magical skills, which included possessing the ability to cure ailments, locate lost property, command imps, control animals, and, should the mood take him, place the occasional curse on those that had offended him. He also achieved wider fame by claiming to be the oldest man in England, and on the 19th of September 1908 an interview with him appeared in the Essex Newsman, although he gave his name as Frederick Pinkengale, in which he told the reporter that he was 105 years old, attributing his longevity to just going on living, that's all. Although he boasted in the article that he was good for another 20 years, prophecy evidently wasn't one of his magical powers, as he died on the 10th of April the following year. On his deathbed, he promised those nursing him that there would be one more demonstration of his magical powers, and sure enough, at his funeral, when the hearse pulled up outside the church, the 2 horses drawing it stepped out of the shaft and trotted away. Following his death, it was revealed that, contrary to his claim of being Britain's oldest man, he had in fact been born in 1816, making him a youthful 93 years old at the time of his passing. Mention of the churchyard brings me back to the ghosts of Canewdon, for several of them are known to drift or stride around it when darkness has fallen. There is without doubt a definite atmosphere here, even in the daylight hours, and the fact that the stocks are still kept in the village lock-up next to the churchyard did encourage me to proceed cautiously, just in case. The most widely reported apparition seen here is that of the faceless lady, who appears in the churchyard on dark, moonless nights. Some witnesses claim she wears a bonnet beneath which she has no face or no head, depending on which account you read. She glides serenely across the churchyard, drifts through the west gate, and then continues down to the bank of the nearby River Crouch, where she melts into thin air, as it is a well-known fact that ghosts cannot cross water, although she did once cause a great deal of consternation by appearing in the old ferry house on the other side of the river, where, to quote a contemporary source, well, the Leicester Mercury of June the 12th, 1969, she had quite a ball, opening and shutting windows and creeping into empty beds, all the time breathing heavily through the headless gap beneath her bonnet, although who experienced this if the beds were empty was not made clear. But back to the churchyard. Some people claim to have seen strange, inexplicable lights flickering over the gravestones during the hours of darkness, whilst others have heard the sound of someone chopping wood here in the dead of night, at an hour when no sensible person would even consider doing so, not least for the fear of encountering the faceless woman, who has an unnerving habit of suddenly lifting witnesses off their feet and throwing them to the ground, a terrifying prospect for anyone wielding an axe. Such is Canewdon's otherworldly reputation that it has become something of a magnet for thrill-seekers on Halloween, so much so that the police now put up barricades in the local lanes to close off approaches to the village to all non-residents. Which means that only those who live here are able, should they wish, to avail themselves of the opportunity of walking around the church 3 times to summon the ghost of a witch, or, if they're really daring, 13 times to summon the devil. And finally, there's the tradition that if you walk backwards around the church 4 times, you will find yourself taken back in time, an intriguing belief which I have decided to put to the test, and have just completed my 4th reverse circumnavigation of St. Nicholas's Church, and as you can plainly see, nothing has happened. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. But now we must move on, for we have 3 more counties to visit, and time is very much against us, although I couldn't let us leave Essex, dear viewer, without taking you to the site of what was once dubbed the most haunted house in England, Borley Rectory. Nothing now survives of the not particularly attractive red brick house that has long been infamous in paranormal circles, and over which intense debate about the events that once occurred within its walls still rages. The tiny village of Borley nestles amidst tranquil countryside close to the Essex-Suffolk border, and one of the most striking things about it is just how unwelcoming it is to those who come here in search of the story of its supernatural associations. The village church is rarely open, and its car park is chained and padlocked to deter the over-enthusiasm of the numerous visitors to whom it and its surroundings have long been a place of pilgrimage. Parking on the road that passes through the village is nigh on impossible, and asking a resident, should you happen to encounter one, about the current state of the haunting is likely to be met with a frosty response. And yet people still find their way to this little corner of rural England, and several of them have left reporting inexplicable happenings and ghostly encounters. The rectory was built between 1862 and 1863 and replaced an earlier building that had burnt down in 1841. It was constructed by the Reverend Harry Bull, on tradition maintains part of the site of a medieval monastery. Legend tells of an illicit love affair between one of the monks and a nun from a nearby convent. Their planned elopement was discovered, and both were condemned to death for their misdemeanour. The monk was hanged, but the nun was bricked up alive in the cellars of the monastery. Thereafter, her ghostly form was often reported drifting over the place where her earthly remains were reputedly entombed. At first, she seems to have been a conventional ghostly nun, one of hundreds condemned to roam the ethereal plains of Britain for committing similar transgressions with lusty clerics. But the building of the rectory in 1863, athwart the route of her ghostly jaunts, seems to have stirred her to indignation, and she made her displeasure known from the outset. Many was the occasion when family members would look up from the dinner table to see her mournful face watching them through the window. Indignant at their ghostly stalker's rudeness, the Reverend Bull had the window bricked up. Unperturbed, the phantom sister unleashed a bout of poltergeist activity around the house. The ghostly happenings grew more and more dramatic, and by the time Henry Bull was succeeded as rector by his son Harry in 1892, they were interfering with the everyday running of the house. Several servants refused to work in a place where a ghostly coach could at any moment come tearing across the lawn and then vanish into thin air. Such was the house's terrible reputation that when Harry died in 1927, no fewer than 12 clergymen turned down the post of rector. In 1928, the Reverend G.E. Smith and his wife, both avowed sceptics, moved into the empty building. Within weeks, the haunting had flared up again. The phantom nun continued with her nocturnal wanderings, but she had apparently now been joined by the ghost of Harry Bull himself. Mysterious footsteps would echo from empty rooms in the dead of night. Strange, incoherent whispering would be heard, and the voice of an invisible woman would moan softly, its low murmur growing louder and louder, until, following a sudden scream of "Don't call us, don't!" the house would again become quiet. In June 1929, having been contacted by the Smiths, the Daily Mirror published the story of the sinister happenings at Borley. Harry Price, founder and honorary director of the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, was sent to the rectory by the newspaper to investigate. He made his first visit on the 12th of June 1929 and began an investigation that would catapult the remote Essex village into the international spotlight. The spirits responded to his arrival with a veritable array of ghostly phenomena. Phantom fingers tapped out messages on a mirror. Invisible hands smashed vases against walls. Keys leapt from keyholes and were thrown to the floor. A tempest of household objects came raining down the staircase. A window pane was broken, and one disgruntled wraith even hurled a candlestick at Harry Price's head. In July 1929, the Smiths had had enough and moved out, and it wasn't until October 1930 that a new rector could be found. His name was Lionel Algernon Foyster, a relative of the original owner, and the dark forces at work within the house marked his arrival with an intensification of activity. An invisible assailant struck his wife Marianne hard across the face. Objects disappeared and were either never seen again, or they would reappear in the most bizarre locations. Harry Price was asked to resume his investigations, and on his first night, as he sat down to dinner with the family, the ghosts welcomed him by turning the wine to ink. But the phenomenon that most intrigued Price was the appearance of the so-called Marianne messages. Addressed to the rector's young wife, these strange, often illegible scribbles appeared upon the walls, imploring her to please get help. By 1937, the Reverend Foyster and his family had moved out, and Harry Price decided he would lease the building for a year. His newspaper advert for assistance drew 200 replies, of whom 40 were chosen to help with the subsequent investigation. In the course of a séance, a spirit claiming to be Harry Bull said that the bodies of a nun and a monk named Fadenock were buried in the garden. Another spirit claimed to be the dead nun, identifying herself as Marie Lair, and told how she had been enticed to Borley from France by a man from the local and influential Waldegrave family. She went on to inform the gathering how she had wished to marry him, but he had strangled her and buried her body beneath the cellar. At a further séance, another spirit informed the sitters that the rectory would be burnt down that very night. Nothing, however, happened. But when Price left the house in 1938, a new tenant, Captain W. H. Gregson, moved in and renamed it the Priory. On the 27th of February 1939, he was sorting books in the hall when a stack toppled over and upset a paraffin lamp. In the ensuing conflagration, several onlookers claimed to have seen writhing figures moving about in the flames, and the ghostly form of a nun standing in one of the burning windows. In 1943, Price paid a visit to the burnt-out ruins and conducted an excavation in the cellar, during which he uncovered several bones which he claimed belonged to a young woman, although they were refused burial in Borley churchyard on account of locals claiming they were in fact the bones of a pig. Price died in 1948, and ever since debate has raged in paranormal circles as to whether the saga was a genuine haunting or nothing more than a cleverly orchestrated fraud. Reports of ghostly sightings in the little churchyard opposite, however, still continue. The phantom nun maintains her weary regime of nocturnal strolls along Nun's Walk. The village church and its surrounds are as eerie as ever, and many visitors speak of a sudden feeling of foreboding that grips them the moment they set foot in the neat little churchyard. Ghostly organ music has been heard wailing from inside the empty church. Investigators have recorded phantom footsteps, mysterious tappings, and even a harsh, menacing cry that sends shivers down the spines of those who listen to the tape. Photographs taken of the building's exterior have contained ghostly forms standing amongst the graves or gliding along the uneven paths of what is still one of England's spookiest places. Yes, indeed, Borley Rectory itself might have been demolished in 1944 and its site now encroached upon by modern housing, but the story of the supposed ghostly activity that made its name famous throughout the world still has the ability to instill feelings of fear and fascination in equal measure, and long may it continue to do so. But now we must bid Essex farewell as we cross the border into Suffolk and make our way to the village of Wickham Market, near to which lies Potsford Wood, and I can already feel the chill in the air as we approach it. Potsford Wood is an eerie and sinister place, even on the brightest of summer days, but on a wild winter's night it's truly frightening. The trees tower over you, their branches interlocking in grim embrace, their menacing canopy shielding the wood from the moon's dull glow, causing an aura of baleful foreboding to hang heavy in the air, and you find yourself constantly looking over your shoulder, ever wary of the malevolent forces that are said to roam the sylvan depths of this menacing place. Almost lost amidst its creeping carpets of nettle and bracken, you will find the decaying remains of the Potsford Gibbet, and on it is a plaque remembering the last person to be executed in Wickham Market, Jonas or Jonas Snell, who was hanged on the 14th of April 1699 for the murder of his master, local miller John Bullard, and his father. It was a particularly horrible crime. Snell went to the mill at midnight on the 8th of February 1698, and finding the two men playing cards with neighbours, waited for the neighbours to leave, took a sledgehammer and used it to smash in the skulls of his two victims. Arrested, he was found guilty of murder at his subsequent trial and was sentenced to death. Whilst awaiting his fate in Bury Jail, Snell supposedly made his confession in the form of a poem, which, if I'm to be brutally honest, was probably more the work of the printer who published it, B. Smith of Woodbridge, than of Mr. Snell. Part of it read, "The father's grey and aged head received the leading blow. Then, as I was by Satan led, I struck the son also, who straight arose and likewise cried, I had his father killed, and ere I could be satisfied, their dearest blood I spilled." Following his execution, Snell's body was brought to Potsford Wood, where it was hung in chains by the road that ran from Wickham Market to Leatheringham, and where it remained for 41 years, birds even building their nests in the hollow skull. There is a local tale that about the year 1740, Mr. Gall, a tailor of Wickham Market, a man who held very decided opinions on the subject matter of ghosts, not believing it possible for the spirits of the departed to be allowed to visit the earth, was walking the road between Wickham Market and Leatheringham, where he had arranged to measure several customers for new clothing. As he passed the gibbet, he looked up at the grisly remains hanging in chains and said, "It would be very queer if you were to just now step down from your exalted position." That night he was returning home in the dark when, as he passed the gibbet, he saw to his horror that the skeleton was gone. He could not at first believe his eyes, but on a closer examination he found it to be a fact, and immediately an odd feeling began to creep over him. Continuing his homeward journey, he suddenly became aware of what he thought was the sound of clanking chains, which appeared to be very close behind him, so he walked faster. The sound increased, and he began to run, and it seemed as if the jingling noise was at his very heels. His strength lasted long enough to land him on the floor of his house in Wickham Market, and when his exhaustion had passed away, his opinions about ghostly apparitions were completely changed. When his wife had helped him to remove his clothes and get to bed, she heard something rattling in one of the pockets of his coat, and on searching it, she discovered a thimble and a few odd coppers, which accounted for the jingling he had mistaken for the malefactor's chains. It seems that during the time he was at Leatheringham, the order had been given to finally take down the remains of Jonas Snell, and they had been buried beneath the gibbet. Jonas Snell might well have been placed in the earth beneath the Potsford gibbet, but he most certainly does not lie at rest, and several people who have been strolling through the wood and who have stopped to gaze upon the curious remains of the old gibbet have turned to resume their ramble, only to find themselves confronted by a dark figure standing menacingly behind them. To their horror, they see that beneath its hooded cloak there is nothing but a grimacing hollow-eyed skull staring back at them. In the 1980s, a passing truck driver stopped on the road outside the wood to answer the call of nature. Now, I have to say that this on its own is a pretty impressive achievement, since the one thing I had great difficulty doing when visiting the wood was finding somewhere to park, and that was in a car. So for a lorry to stop on the narrow road, well, let's just say he was asking for trouble, and trouble he did indeed find. Noticing the remains of the gibbet, he stopped to read the plaque, when suddenly he felt a sharp tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found himself staring at the hooded black figure that had frightened many before and has frightened many since. There is no doubt about it, this is a chilling and eerie location, and it is certainly not the sort of place at which to linger for too long. So let's head back to the road and make our way to the Suffolk coast, where we shall pay a visit to Dunwich, the lost city of England. The tiny Suffolk village of Dunwich is both haunted and haunting. It's a sobering thought that, as you pull up on the car park alongside the beach, and the waves crash onto the shingles within spitting distance from you, had you been on this very same spot in the early 13th century, and obviously you wouldn't be pulling up on a car park if it was, but had it been the 13th century, you would have been a mile away from the sea. "Goodness me," I hear you exclaim, "where's that mile gone?" Well, I'm glad you exclaimed that, because you see, Dunwich is the town that quite literally fell off a cliff. Now, technically speaking, that last statement, although wonderfully dramatic, isn't accurate. In fact, the correct way to describe what happened to what was once a busy, thriving port, and one of the largest towns in England to boot, is that, piece by piece, it was consumed by the unrelenting waters of the North Sea over a period of some 700 years, which is why Dunwich is often referred to as England's medieval Atlantis. Stand on the beach today and look out across the grey sullen waters of the North Sea, and you are looking out across the townscape of Dunwich, albeit you can't actually see any of it as it lies beneath the sea. But let's just for a moment imagine it's 1280 and you're standing on this very same spot. Boy oh boy is it busy round here. We're surrounded by a prosperous port, a thriving town that rivals the city of London in size, with a population of some 3,000 people. Merchants' ships fill the harbour. The joyous peals of bells from its 8 churches ring out, and all is bustle, all is life. And then came the storms. On the night of the 1st of January 1286, a storm surge swept in and took part of the east edge of the town. Just over a year later, in February 1287, another storm swept across the coast, redrawing large sections of the coastline, and Dunwich edged a little closer to the sea, or to be more precise, the sea edged a little closer to Dunwich. Barely had the town recovered from this disaster when on the 13th and 14th of December that year, St. Lucia's flood, one of the worst recorded floods in history, devastated vast tracts of the Netherlands and Germany, claiming the lives of between 50 and 80,000 people and causing untold havoc on this coastal region of England, where it killed hundreds and wreaked further devastation on Dunwich, more of which went into the sea. Another storm in 1347 took a further 400 houses, and around the 16th of January 1362, a cyclone caused an immense surge tide that claimed another 36,000 lives across Europe and devoured much of what remained of Dunwich. Over the centuries that followed, the remnants of the once great town slipped bit by bit beneath the waves, and today Dunwich is little more than a small rural village with a resident population, according to the 2021 census, of 189 hardy souls. One of the last of its 8 churches to succumb to the allure of the sea was All Saints', once one of Suffolk's largest churches, until the insatiable appetite of the sea began nibbling away at it. The cliffs began inching closer and closer to the ragged remnants of the old church in the 17th century, and in the 18th century the building was declared a lost cause and abandoned to its fate. However, it became a symbol of Dunwich's lost battle with the elements. Artists sketched it, and photographers captured its final years as the cliff top crept ever closer. By the early 20th century, little of the church remained, and with every passing year, more and more began tumbling off the cliffs, until on Monday the 17th of November 1919, the Daily Express announced the sad news that the half-ruined tower of All Saints' Church, Dunwich, Suffolk, fell into the sea on Saturday, and at last became a victim of the heavy seas during a gale. A solitary column of masonry was all that was left, and it wasn't long before that too followed over the cliff edge, and All Saints was no more. To add a touch of the macabre to the sad tale, the churchyard also went, and there are tales of skulls, thigh bones and pelvic bones tumbling onto the beach below, while other accounts tell of human remains protruding from the cliff face, where they became something of a tourist attraction. One solitary tombstone, left perched at the edge of the great abyss, became symbolic of the church's lost battle with the forces of nature. Dunwich's days of glory might belong to a long-ago age, but the story of its decline and gradual disappearance into the sea is fascinating, awe-inspiring, and, of course, haunting. Ghosts aplenty are known to wander its shoreline, not to mention the sunken ruins that lie offshore. It is said that on storm-tossed nights, when the wind howls and moans across the shingle, you can hear the bells of Dunwich's lost churches tolling beneath the sea. Fishermen whisper of strange ethereal lights shining from beneath the dark waters, and others speak of spectral figures seen beneath the murky sea, whilst some even claim to have seen the ghosts of long-dead citizens shuffling along the cliff-tops. One of the most famous legends of Suffolk folklore is centred on the beach at Dunwich. It is a tragic story of betrayal and heartbreak. So come, take a seat on the beach, and let me tell you the tale of the dark heart of Dunwich. Eva, the main protagonist in our little saga, was a local maiden who lived, according to most accounts, in the 1200s. She was due to marry the son of a wealthy local landowner. However, with the wedding day rapidly approaching, she was seduced by a handsome ne'er-do-well who, having had his wicked way with the poor girl, deserted her for a life at sea. Her grief was immense, and each night she would make her way to the cliff tops and gaze out to sea, watching for any sign of her lover's return. One night the grief proved so intense that she cut out her heart and flung it out to sea. Her blood blended with the water, binding her life force to the beach, and ever since her figure, I want to say ghostly figure, but since she couldn't, according to the legend, actually die, this wouldn't be accurate, is said to roam the shoreline on dark winter nights, searching for her missing heart, which, so the legend concludes, sometimes washes up on the beach, bringing misfortune to any poor soul who happens to pick it up. There can be no doubt about it, Dunwich is a special, special place. Standing on its shoreline at twilight, staring out across the grey expanse of the North Sea, it makes for a great flight of the imagination to picture the streets, churches, graveyards, merchants' homes, inns, taverns, and civic buildings that lie drowned before you. The gulls wheel overhead, their raucous cries mingling with the thunderous percussion of the crashing waves. But then all falls silent for a brief second, and you will sense in that moment of quietude that you truly have walked with ghosts on Dunwich shore. Our journey through Suffolk continues inland and along the road that runs between Beccles and Blythburgh, the A143, on which you might easily drive straight past a sturdy old oak that stands in the grounds of Roos Hall without paying it a second glance, although you might experience an inexplicable feeling of foreboding as you pass it. Known as Nelson's Tree, supposedly on account of the family who once owned the hall having connections with Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson, it looks truly menacing, and tradition has bestowed such a sinister reputation upon it that most people know it as the Hanging Tree. This gnarled, twisted, and ancient specimen is thought to be at least 700 years old, and at some stage in its long history it was, so local law maintains, pressed into service for the carrying out of executions, and many a criminal is said to have ended his days dangling from its branches. Although I do find myself wondering if there were in fact such a large number of dastardly felons in these parts to justify the many preface. Just saying. It is also claimed that the reason for the contorted shape of the oak is that some of the chains in which the criminals were displayed after their executions have worked their way into the trunk. Whether such a brutal history is true is debatable, but that hasn't stopped several ghostly tales becoming associated with the tree, chief amongst them being that the spirits of those who perished on its branches haunt the area around it. Some versions of the story claim that following their executions, their bodies were buried in the ground nearby, condemning their tormented souls to wander the vicinity for eternity, hence the dreadful feeling of foreboding that some people are said to have experienced on the road passing it. Sightings of shadowy figures, the sound of spectral sobbing, not to mention sudden drops in temperature near the tree, have been reported by several visitors over the years, whilst some witnesses claim to have seen a man in torn trousers and a brown jacket who stands alongside the oak and simply stares at them with unblinking eyes. The most persistent story concerning the tree, though, is that of the White Lady, whose reason for haunting it is lost in the mists of time, but whose phantom figure is said to walk 6 times around the tree in order to summon the devil, although why she should want to do so is also lost in the mists of time. So we shall leave her to a devilish dabbling and head for the nearby town of Bungay, where, after an absence of several stories, Black Shuck, the demon Hound, comes trotting back onto the timeline. Black Shuck is a spectral dog said to haunt the coastal regions and countryside of East Anglia, particularly Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, hence his previous appearances on Pitsea Mount and at Hadleigh Castle. Descriptions portray him as a massive, evil-looking hound with shaggy black fur, blazing red eyes, or from time to time a single cyclopean red eye. He is possessed of a chilling supernatural presence and is guaranteed to strike absolute terror into those that come within his baleful gaze. Tales of Shuck stretch back centuries and are a major feature of East Anglian folklore. According to legend, encountering Black Shuck is an omen of death or misfortune. Some stories claim that those who see him will die within a year, while other versions claim that an encounter with the dread beast can bring on a bout of madness from which the victim seldom recovers. So deeply rooted is Black Shuck in English folklore that in March 2025 the Post Office released a new set of stamps titled Myths and Legends, and Black Shuck was depicted howling menacingly on the face of one of them. Bungay is indelibly linked with the legend of Black Shuck, so much so that he features prominently on the town's weather vane and coat of arms, and each August the Black Shuck Festival brings visitors here from all over the world to enjoy reenactments, retellings and reproductions of all things Shuck. One of the main attractions is a giant black dog that pads his way through the town in procession, weaving around cars and pedestrians alike, although the fact that he appears to be wearing modern trainers on his numerous paws or feet is perhaps a bit of a giveaway that those who encounter him have little to fear from this particular demon hound. So how did Bungay become renowned as such a major haunt of Black Shuck? Well, it all has to do with the splendid St. Mary's Church, to which we will now venture. As we head through the churchyard, it would be remiss of me not to draw your attention to the mysterious Druid's Stone, also known as the Devil's Stone and the Giant's Grave. It is thought that this ancient monolith arrived in what is now Bungay in the Ice Age, and a plaque on the wall of the churchyard informs us that it attracted the attention of the Druid priests because they could strike a piece of flint against it and cause sparks to fly out, providing fire for heating and cooking, a gift from the god within. Whatever its age and original purpose, several traditions are attached to this sullen-looking lump of weather-beaten stone, not least of them being that if you ask it a question, a voice from inside will answer. Oh, and I almost forgot, if you walk around it 12 times and then knock on it, the devil will appear. I must confess I'm getting rather dizzy with all these circular jaunts in my attempts to summon the devil, so with your permission we will forgo this heaven-sent opportunity, hell-sent opportunity, and instead head inside the church, wherein is located a particularly splendid depiction of Black Shuck. And why is he here? Well, this is a story that is guaranteed to send a shiver down the spine and a chill to the marrow. So take a pew and let me tell you about a strange and terrible wonder wrought very late in the parish church of Bungay on the 4th of August, 1577. As the morning service began, a fearsome tempest suddenly erupted outside the church. Lightning streaked across the sky, thunder shook the very foundations of the building, and rain and sleet pelted the windows. As the parishioners listened to the dreadful commotion outside, thanking God that they were safely sheltered from the storm, the church doors suddenly burst open, and a hideous black dog, or the devil in such a likeness, burst into the church and, with great swiftness and incredible haste, trotted along the aisle, passed between two persons as they were kneeling upon their knees, and wrung the necks of them both at one instant, clean backward, insomuch they strangely died. Turning, the hound brushed against the back of another member of the congregation, rendering it as drawn together and shrunk up as if it were a piece of leather scorched in a hot fire. At more or less the same moment, the demon hound also appeared in Holy Trinity Church, Blythburgh, some 12 miles away. It would take us around 23 minutes to make the trip by car, but we are at present inhabiting an ethereal, virtual world, so let us hop over to Blythburgh to resume our spooky tale. Now, I have to say, the village sign of Blythburgh is pretty darn spooky, to the point of being outright terrifying, but Holy Trinity Church is truly magnificent, and is, not undeservedly, often referred to as the Cathedral of the Marshes. At more or less the exact moment that the hideous beast was causing havoc at Sunday worship in Bungay Church, he also managed to burst in through the doors of Black Church, although I wasn't actually there, so please don't take my word for it. As the congregation turned to see what the ruckus was, the black dog sprang towards them, sank his teeth into a man and a boy, killing them both, and having accomplished its demonic task, it exited through the north door, where the scorch marks left in its wake can still be seen today, albeit when I visited the church, the north door was barricaded by scaffolding from the inside, leaving me wondering if they might be expecting a return visit someday soon. To be honest, the south door opposite has similar marks on it, so perhaps I should have just kept my mouth shut and presented this as the door through which Black Shuck exited. Let me know in the comments section below if you think that's what I should have done. Anyway, I'm getting somewhat weary of being followed about by this big black hound, so let's take another quick look at Blytheborough's creepy village sign and then cross the border into Norfolk to pay a visit to the ruins of St Olave's Priory, or Benfleet Priory as it is also known. Founded in 1239, the priory was located close to the ferry that transported wayfarers back and forth across the River Waveney, the impressive waterway that forms the boundary between Suffolk and Norfolk, or Norfolk and Suffolk, depending on which side of the river you happen to be on. Nearby St Olave's Bridge has long rendered the ferry redundant, and the priory went the way of many a religious foundation when Henry VIII cast his covetous eyes over the monasteries during the dissolution, and in 1546 St Olave's Priory was handed over to Sir Henry Jerningham, who went on to become one of the most trusted courtiers of Queen Mary I, and part of the 16th century house he built here can be found at the site. The ruins of the priory are easily missed, tucked away as they are down a narrow track next to a modern restaurant complex, but when you step through the gate and catch your first glimpse of them, they are both enchanting and intriguing, and you can see why English heritage describes St Olave's as a hidden gem. The undercroft, resplendent with a magnificent vaulted brick ceiling, is as eerie as it is impressive, and although this isn't the largest monastic ruin you could visit, you often have the place to yourself, as few people seem to know of its existence, and some who do complain that they can't actually find it. From a paranormal perspective, the ruins are not the scene of any particularly dramatic phenomena. Inevitably, ghostly monks have been seen and heard around the site, and recently the team from Ghosted UK, having carried out an investigation at the Priory, was sifting through their footage afterwards when they noticed a white figure in the doorway to the undercroft. Tim and Andrew of Ghosted UK have generously allowed me to use the footage in this video. We couldn't debunk it as a mere light reflection or a glare or anything else in the building, Tim told the Daily Mirror. We noticed the figure seemed to move slightly when we walked past it. It could have been a ghost seeing what we were up to. The team also captured some EVP when medium Natasha was speaking on camera, and a creepy-sounding voice muttered what sounded like, "Damn her." Again, the team have kindly allowed me to use the footage here.
It's like 100% real, and we will keep going and going and going until we find out if it's real or not.
St Olave's Priory is certainly worth a visit, but for us time is ebbing by, and we must leave this place to its memories and its shadows as we shake the dust of its history from our shoes and move on to what I truly found to be the creepiest location I visited during filming for this video, St Mary's Church ruin near East Somerton. One of the biggest problems with visiting the haunted ruin of St Mary's Church in the village of East Somerton is actually finding it. A sat-nav can only take you so far. Getting to the village is no problem, but that last leg of the journey down a narrow single-track road borders on torment. And even when you reach the site, it can take a few frustrating moments to realise you've finally found the church, as it has been abandoned for so long now that the surrounding woodland has crept up and over it, with the result that its tumbled-down walls are surrounded by a menacing cohort of skeletal trees that seem determined to keep the casual observer firmly at bay. However, perseverance is the key, and once you notice the church, once you find your way along the short path that leads between the wooden fences that surround it, overcome the feeling of dreadful foreboding that descends on you as you step inside the ruins, a feeling not helped by the pungent aroma of decay that hangs heavy in the air, And once you pause to take in the ivy-draped walls and time-daubed stones, well, let's just say that once you've done all this, it will all have been worth it. For St. Mary's Church might be creepy, but it's also enchanting, and one of the most surprising things about it is that, although there's hardly anything left of it, save its ruined tower and the ragged remnants of its nave, time seems to hang suspended here, and what was intended as a quick visit can easily turn into an hour or more of sheer fascination. So much so that parting can be such sweet sorrow. The church itself dates from the 13th century, and the tower was rebuilt in the 15th. Its history isn't particularly dramatic, other than at some stage in the 17th century it was abandoned, and having served as a barn for a time, it was left for the woodland to consume, which it was more than happy to do with gluttonous appetite. Nowadays, just the tower and the nave survive, one of the walls of the latter being punctured by a massive gap, which gives the impression that a giant burst through it at some time in the past, leaving his, or her, shape in the stone. But the reason we've come here isn't to discuss its history. It's to admire the splendid oak that rises skywards from the leaf-carpeted floor of the nave. For this oak is known as the Witch's Finger, and its story is what brings many an intrepid seeker of the mysterious to the ruins. Now, let me just say that none of what I'm about to tell you can be verified historically, and if I'm to be perfectly honest, the holes in this tale are as large as the one that punctures the wall of the church's ruined nave. But folklore and ghost stories are seldom rooted in provable fact, so should you perchance find yourself reading one of the several websites that aim to discredit this tale, please don't curse me for having told you it. Now, where was I? Oh yes, the Witch's Finger. Long, long ago, as is the case with many of these chilling tales, no actual date is given for when these events supposedly happened. A witch terrorised the district around the church, and the locals, wishing to be rid of her, dragged her one day to St. Mary's Church, where they buried her alive beneath the floor of the nave, the belief being that if she was buried in consecrated ground, she would not be able to haunt the village once she was dead, or, as another version puts it, she wouldn't be able to join Satan down below. As she endured her final moments of torment and agony, this poor woman summoned up all the energy she could muster, and with a dying breath she placed a curse upon the church. Now, as it happens, the witch had a wooden leg, which sprouted into this oak tree, and as it grew, it destroyed the church beneath which her mortal remains lie entombed, necessitating its abandonment. The legend also holds that if you walk around the tree 3 times, here we go again, you will release the witch's spirit, and according to some accounts, you can then ask her any question and she will be compelled to answer you. But take heed, the idea of the witch of East Somerton being summoned forth by casual visitors doesn't play well in the locality, and so a gaggle of guardian ghostly monks are on hand to stop anybody from completing 3 circuits of the witch's finger. Although I should point out that they don't seem to be particularly adept at their task, since social media is awash with clips and accounts of people walking 3 times around the tree in order to summon the witch and get answers to their questions. Are they successful? Well, that's for them to know, and you to find out. But now we must move on, as I have to buy my ticket for tonight's lottery using the numbers that nice old lady I met amidst the ruins of the church gave me. Aiming on broomsticks northwards along the Norfolk coast, we come to the village of Stiffkey, a picturesque coastal hamlet where we encounter a conundrum that has puzzled many a visitor for decades. How the heck do you pronounce its name? Older residents say Stiffkey, while younger ones, not to mention many of the visitors who find their way here, opt for the phonetic Stiffkey. The village sign, meanwhile, hedges its bets and goes for both pronunciations. Lovely as the village is, however, it's not what has brought us here, but rather a chance to visit the captivating salt marshes located just to the north of it. This spectacular biodiverse nature reserve offers sweeping panoramic views that can energise even the most jaded amongst us, and the question you should now be asking yourself is not if you can visit, but rather when. But a serious word of warning. The reason the marshes are so spectacular is that they are tidal and the sea can creep around the unwary, cutting them off, so you really do need to check the time of high tide before you visit and stick rigidly to the instructions given. It is the dangers posed by the tides that lie behind the ghost story of the salt marshes. Stiffkey has long been renowned for the delicious cockles that thrive on, or rather in, the mudflats, and because the mud gives them a distinctive blue tinge, they are known as Stiffkey blues. In the 18th century, the women of the village used to earn a meagre living, gathering cockles from the mudbanks, which they would drop into large sacks and then haul back to the village after a long and exhausting day's toil. One long ago evening, the exact date, as is often the case with these stories, is unspecified, the women were working away on the mudbanks when the weather took a turn for the worse. A thick fog, or roke as it is known around here, rolled in from the sea, and the women thought it best to call it a day and began making their way from the marshes back to the village. However, one young girl, whose name is given as Nancy, had only filled half her sack, so she ignored the pleas of the other cocklers and continued digging in the mud, determined to enjoy a full sack and a profitable day. As she dug, the fog enveloped her, and the tide came in and surrounded her, cutting off her route back to safety. By the time she realised her dilemma, it was too late. She was trapped, unable to see anything, and, more disturbing, unable to be seen by anybody. She started crying out, hoping that the other cocklers would come to her rescue. But although they could hear her anguished screams, they couldn't see her, and the water began creeping up her legs. Local fishermen heard her shouts, but they were unable to launch their boats as the tide was too low. Some of the village men had smaller boats, and they put out to go to Nancy's assistance, but the fog was so thick they simply could not find her. And all the while, the poor girl's howls of anguish became more and more desperate as she cursed God, the sea, and the roke, until the unrelenting waters engulfed her, and all fell silent. They found her body the next morning. Her eyes were wide open, her face was frozen in terror, seaweed was tangled up in her hair. Her fists were clenched around the knife she used to gather the cockles, and she was holding her half-filled sack. She was carried back to the village in solemn procession and was laid to rest in the village churchyard. But her spirit is said to roam the marshes to this day, her screams of terror echoing across the mudbanks and twisting creeks when the mantle of the night has fallen across them, warning all who might be tempted to risk the dangers posed by the tides to keep their distance, lest they suffer the same fate. And so the screaming Cockler of Stiffkey or Stiffkey joins our litany of tragedy. But we must leave her to her eternal watch and make our way across Norfolk to visit the creepy, time-worn bulk of Castle Rising Castle. So spooky, they named it twice. Defensively situated in a grassy saucer created by the man-made earthworks of massive ramparts that surround it, Castle Rising Castle boasts an impressive pedigree that stretches back to 1140, when the magnificent Norman keep was built by William Albini to celebrate his marriage to the widow of Henry I. Over the next 400 years, it evolved into a magnificent residence until, following the execution of its then owner, the Duke of Norfolk, in 1572, it was abandoned and became little more than a ruin, its walls made precarious by a proliferation of rabbits burrowing into its great earthen banks. Today the castle ruin is as impressive as ever and can be numbered amongst the largest and most ornate in England. Ascending the great stone staircase and passing into the keep, one is greeted by an enigmatic maze of corridors and passageways which lead to a fascinating sequence of rooms, galleries, and tiny staircases. The upper rooms are said to be haunted by the ghost of one of the castle's most notorious former residents, Isabella, the she-wolf of France. As the former mistress of Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella was instrumental in the deposition and horrific murder of her husband, Edward II, in 1327. It is a widely held misconception that her son, Edward III, following the execution of her accomplice Roger Mortimer, imprisoned her at the castle in 1331. Rather, Isabella lived in regal splendour at Castle Rising, and she was free to move with her retinue between her various residences, as befitted a lady of social standing. Legend states that this formidable woman sank into an old age that was racked by violent dementia, her last troubled years being spent in the rooms of the upper stories. She died at her castle in Hertford on the 23rd of August 1358 and was buried in the monastery of the Greyfriars by Newgate in London. The echoes of her troubled last years, however, are still said to rebound through the eerie corridors of Castle Rising Castle. Visitors have been shocked to hear the sound of hysterical cackling around the top story of the building, whilst residents in the village over which the castle now looms have occasionally been disturbed by ghostly screams and maniacal laughter echoing from the castle in the dead of night. But now we must plunge southwards, our journey taking us into Cambridgeshire and to the town of Huntingdon, where, just to the left of the sign that welcomes us, although hidden from the view of passing motorists, is the Nuns' Bridge, across which a legion of ghostly tales come marching from its mist-shrouded past. The bridge was once a section of the main route between Huntingdon and the A1, making it a lot busier than it is today. However, a series of fatal accidents, combined with the effects of increased traffic and heavier vehicles on the ancient fabric, led to demands for the construction of a wider road, more suited to the demands of the 20th century, and in the late 1960s or early 1970s, a new carriageway opened alongside where we stopped to admire the sign, and the Nuns' Bridge became a picturesque backwater, it and its approaches close to all but pedestrians and bicycles, not to mention the occasional witch with a broomstick, such as the one I encountered on my visit, who can be seen in the distance in this footage, although on stopping for a chat I discovered she was a lovely lady and was in fact a content creator who was also filming for a YouTube Halloween special. The bridge dates from the 15th or 16th century, although it was largely reconstructed in the 18th century. In the early 1920s, the local county council decided on much-needed improvements to the bridge on account of the fact that the continual motor traffic made it a source of danger to pedestrians, and in 1925 His Majesty's Office of Works declared it a monument the preservation of which is of national importance, and that same year the bridge's south parapet wall was rebuilt. On the 10th of January 1951, the Nuns' Bridge was given Grade 2 listed status, and as already mentioned, almost 20 years later, it was bypassed, thus making it a truly picturesque relic from days long gone. And of course, it's haunted. Why else would we be here? The bridge is probably named for its proximity to the Benedictine nunnery that once stood nearby, now the site of Hinchingbrook House, which since 1970 has been part of Hinchingbrook School. Each Halloween period, the house embraces its paranormal connections by hosting the award-winning experience Horror at Hinchingbrook House. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Which invites attendees to experience pure adrenaline and terror as you journey through dark rooms, forests and mazes, being hunted by axe-wielding freaks, chainsaw maniacs, killer clowns, demonic creatures, and more. I'm presuming this happens over half-term when the pupils are away. Either that or our education system has really gone to pot. But then I've seen adolescents, so who knows? But back to the bridge. Interestingly, all the old newspaper accounts of it, not to mention the 1951 Grade 2 listing, have it as the Nuns' Bridge plural, whereas modern accounts refer to it as the Nuns' Bridge singular, which means it could, as some claim, be named for the spectral nun that is said to appear on it. The story goes that this nun became romantically involved with a monk, and they would enjoy furtive trysts on the bridge at night. But then the fickle finger of fate pointed its bony digit at the cavorting couple, and tragedy followed them onto the bridge. The nun became pregnant, their affair was discovered by the prioress of the nunnery, and then one of three possible things happened. 1. Both were executed for their affair. A bit harsh if you ask me. 2. The nun was so mortified at finding that she was with child that she threw herself from the bridge into the waters below. 3. The nun's brother was so furious at his sister for having brought shame on the family that he drowned her in the brook. Whatever the cause of her death, her ghost has over the years made regular appearances on the bridge, a forlorn phantom that strikes terror into the hearts of those who see her, and which, according to the local tradition, was the cause of several of the accidents that occurred hereabouts when this was part of the A604, later the A104, by suddenly appearing in front of startled motorists, causing them to swerve to avoid her. The story of the affair between a nun and a monk appeared to be given a veneer of credibility when in 1834, during building work at Hinchingbrook House, builders unearthed the skeletons of a man and a woman, the woman's remains showing possible evidence of childbirth. However, Mark Egerton, author of the wonderfully informative The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire, a must-read for anyone interested in finding out more about the ghosts of this region, points out that the skeletons were forensically tested in 2014 and were found to be much older than the Priory. So they probably weren't the bones of the nun and the monk. The ghostly nun, though, continues to make her phantom forays onto the bridge, where she is sometimes joined by the ghost of the prioress. Some accounts say it is the ghost of a nurse, and a male ghost whose identity is not certain, but who is thought to be the revenant of the nun's brother, who has hopefully been condemned to an eternity of torment for the shabby way in which he treated his sibling, not to mention his nephew or niece-to-be. But time, as ever, is our enemy, so we must wave goodbye to this lovely spot and stride off along the A14. Incidentally, just as an aside, mention of all these A roads got me wondering if there is an A666, and sure enough, there is. It runs between Bolton in Greater Manchester and Samsbury in Lancashire. Inevitably, its local nickname is the Devil's Highway, and if that font of all knowledge, Wikipedia, is to be believed, it has a crash rate 3 times higher than motorways in the borough. Anyway, I digress, but that little digression has at least killed the time it has taken us to travel from Huntingdon to the village of Conington, where is located our final creepy location, the Crossing of Death. As the high-speed trains thunder past the village of Conington, they race over a tiny crossing that 2 tragic accidents that occurred on it in 1948 have endowed with a reputation so sinister that it has become known as the Crossing of Death. In 1948, the gates to the crossing were operated manually, and drivers would need to get out of their car to open them before being able to drive over the crossing. On Monday the 1st of March that year, 5 German prisoners of war were killed here when, in a dense fog, the lorry they were travelling in was hit by a light engine being driven by Mr. Ernest Edward Gallant. 7 months later, on Saturday the 16th of October, Colonel Arthur Holditch Mellows, a former mayor of Peterborough, who was returning home from an afternoon shooting on Conington Fen in his black Chrysler, approached the crossing at around 5:25 that afternoon. Pulling up to allow his friend, Mr. Andrew Francis Percival, to get out and open the gate, the colonel waited for him to do so, edged forward to cross over the track, and drove straight into the path of a Hitchin-bound express train. The car turned over several times before coming to rest a total wreck. Colonel Mellows was thrown from the vehicle and was dead by the time Mr. Percival could reach him. The body of the colonel's black Labrador was recovered from the wreckage and was, it is said, buried alongside the crossing. The colonel's funeral service at Peterborough Cathedral on Thursday the 21st of October was attended by a vast congregation that, according to the Peterborough Standard, represented every facet of public life. From that point on, Conington's reputation as the Crossing of Death was sealed, and it wasn't long before rumours were circulating that it was haunted. Signalmen who were assigned what must have been a lonely posting at the Conington signal box established in the aftermath of the tragedies would often hear the sound of the crossing gates being opened and closed. Sometimes they would catch glimpses of a large black car approaching the crossing, but when they went to open the gates for it, there was no car there. The aptly named Mr. Norman Jinks, who was in charge of the signal box throughout the 1960s, frequently heard the sound of ghostly tyres crunching over the gravel, whilst other signalmen claimed that they heard voices chattering excitedly around the crossing. As one bemused worker put it when interviewed about his experiences by the BBC in 1973, "I wish those poor souls who got killed on this crossing had took their souls with them." The signal box was removed in the mid-1970s, and today the crossing is fully automated, a barrier replacing the old gates that were there at the time of the accidents. One of the most frightening things about the crossing, or at least one of the most frightening things for me when I visited it, was just how potholed the approach roads are. But there are still those who prefer to avoid the crossing of death when the lengthening shadows of the night stretch across the remote expanse of Connington Fen. And so our journey around the haunted hotspots of East Anglia draws to its conclusion as the sun rises over the streets, lanes and fields, and the ghosts that roam them return to wherever it is they spend their daylight hours. Unless, of course, they happen to be revenants who actually roam the daylight hours, in which case they just stay put and await the arrival of some hapless mortal to come blundering into their spectral orbit. Of course, a video such as this can only be a sampler of the spectral delights that await the intrepid seeker of the paranormal in this history-steeped, mysterious and picturesque region, and there are many other haunted locations that await your discovery, and I would urge you, should the opportunity arise, to visit several, if not all of the locations I have featured. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Till we meet again in the twilight world of the paranormal, dear viewer, stay safe, and when you snuggle down beneath the blankets tonight, do have very sweet and pleasant dreams.